Hello and welcome to today's event, What Comes Next for New York Youth Justice. This event is brought to you today by the Imprint. We are a daily news publication that is dedicated to rigorous, in-depth journalism focused on the nation's child welfare and juvenile justice systems, as well as housing, economic, mental health, and educational issues faced by children and families. My name is Michael Fitzgerald. I'm the New York-based senior editor for the Imprint, covering all of those issues I just mentioned, mainly in New York and sometimes around the country with my colleagues in other states. So today we are here for a very important discussion. I'm going to give you a brief overview of where we are in New York with youth justice, less than 10 minutes. And then we're going to hear from our three distinguished panelists, up to 10 minutes each roughly, followed by 10 to 15 minutes of discussion, and then time for audience questions before we wrap up. First I'm going to introduce our guests today. We are so thrilled to have this group. We've got Julia Davis, who's the Director of Youth Justice and Child Welfare for the Children's Defense Fund's New York chapter. Julia has spent nearly 2 decades advocating for vulnerable children through civil rights, litigation, public policy, and philanthropy. And Children's Defense Fund is a well-known national child advocacy organization that works to uplift all children, especially poor children and children of color, by advocating for policies in child welfare and education. We're also joined by Adilene Sierra. She's a South Bronx native who worked as a community organizer there before becoming a research assistant with Youth Represent, helping lead their youth justice research collaborative. That's a very interesting project, a collective developed in partnership with CUNY, the CUNY Public Science Project, Youth Represent, Children's Defense Fund, and the Citizens Committee for Children of New York to center the lives and conditions of those most impacted by an important reform law in juvenile justice, which we're going to discuss, Raise the Age. And they do their work using participatory action research to join experts with direct experience of prosecution and incarceration as youth with academics and advocates. So their court watchers spent many hours a day, multiple times a week, across many months, taking detailed and standardized notes of proceedings in court proceedings involving youth. And their initial report was based on many months and 400 hours of observations from monitors who filled up notebooks with pages and pages of detailed observations about how the system is handling cases involving youth accused of crime. So really excited to hear about that work. We are also happy to have here today Gary Ivory. He's the president of the Youth Advocate Programs. It's a national nonprofit that gives communities alternatives to incarcerating and placing young people in residential treatment facilities. They work in 30 states, including District of Columbia, and this is a relatively new role for Gary. It's a promotion that comes 30 years after he began his career as a frontline youth advocate. And his passion for social justice is rooted in Pittsburgh, Texas, where as a child, he lost 3 of his 14 siblings to prison. Before joining YAP, Ivory served as a chaplain in the role of youth minister at a state prison in New Jersey. So we are so thrilled to have this group here today. And before we fully proceed, I just want to give thanks to our sponsor, the Tao Foundation, for making this conversation possible today. They support innovative programs and system reform in the fields of juvenile and criminal justice, medicine, higher education, and culture. So a little bit of housekeeping. We will do our best to get to as many questions as possible from the audience. So you'll see a little chat at the bottom. I think everybody pretty much knows the drill at this point with these Zoom gatherings. You can just enter your questions at any time, and we'd love to hear your questions because after the panelists each deliver their sort of pitches for about 10 minutes each, we're going to do a roundtable, and we'd love to have thoughtful, provocative material to discuss. So I've got some of my own questions, but we'd also love to hear what your thoughts are and your responses to what is being discussed, and we will do our best to get to as many as possible. And since everyone always wonders this, we will be sending out a recording of this to anybody who's signed up. So, okay, great. So let's begin. We are here today because we are now just over a year into implementation of what's known as Raise the Age. This is considered to be the most significant overhaul of juvenile justice in a generation for this state, following decades of advocacy, litigation, and federal investigations into the treatment of teens, in the treatment of all young people in both adult and juvenile facilities across the state. New York was one of the last states to pass this to raise its age. What the law did was lift the age of adult criminal responsibility to 18. It ended the automatic prosecution of anyone under 18 as an adult. It also permanently barred young people from being held in adult facilities pre or post trial. Last year, North Carolina became the final state in America to end the automatic prosecution of 16-year-olds as adults. New York just barely beat them, but there are still 3 other states that still consider all 17-year-olds to be adults in the eyes of the law. That includes Georgia, Texas, Wisconsin. But there are proposals moving through each of those legislatures right now that would raise the minimum age to 18 for criminal responsibility, except for the most violent crimes. And if you go to our website, imprintnews.org, you should see some coverage of that in the coming days, if it's not already up, or in the coming weeks. So, and the reason these laws have been passing is because decades of research, particularly in cognitive psychology, have found that youth have a greater capacity than adults to grow out of criminal behavior. And this has helped fuel a nationwide movement to raise states' ages of criminal responsibility. So anyway, that's kind of the wonky explanation, but to put it in more tangible terms, I think one number that's really helpful is 2,967. That is the number of youth under the age of 18 who were held, detained in adult jails or prisons in the year 2016. So that was the year before Governor Andrew Cuomo in New York signed the Raise the Age law. And that was a key focus of advocacy, was those nearly 3,000 young people annually who are being held in those facilities. And that includes places like Fishkill Correctional in upstate New York, or Rikers Island in New York City, or the Monroe County Jail in Rochester out in western New York. And some of these facilities became notorious globally, in some cases, for tragic incidents involving teens held there who experienced abuse. But due to Raise the Age, there is a new reality for youth involved in the justice system. And that is best illustrated by the number 0. That is the number of young people under 18 who were held in adult jails and prisons last year in 2020, once the Raise the Age reform was fully implemented. So that's a huge, huge change for any young person and their family if they become involved with the justice system. And instead of spending time in those facilities, they might end up somewhere more like this. This is a nonprofit run facility out in Jefferson County in far western New York that we covered about 2 years ago. It's a more home-like environment. It's less restrictive. Not every young person who becomes involved with the justice system will end up somewhere like that in New York. It's for lower level offenses, but I think it illustrates the direction the whole system is going, which is either keeping young people at home with support services and rehabilitation services if they are accused of a crime, or keeping them in the least restrictive setting possible. And this is a good example of that. I mean, look at that kitchen. That's nicer than my kitchen in New York. So, okay. So there's other things that have changed a lot, though, in New York in the juvenile justice space, even before Raise the Age. It's important to mention felony and misdemeanor arrests of 16 and 17-year-olds who were affected by that reform. They had plummeted over the last decade. And even juvenile probation, a system which in theory grew because you added 16 and 17-year-olds at the end of the decade, even with the addition of many 16 and 17-year-olds, that number still shrank dramatically in the past decade. And with all these changes, public opinion has also been shifting. So this is a survey we just reported on. It was from earlier this month. It was an online survey of 1,000 adults by the Youth First Initiative. And you can see this is national. And of course, we take every poll with a grain of salt these days, but even considering that, even given the margin of error, I mean, still 80% support for increasing spending on youth rehabilitation, on social workers, on mental health counselors. So, I think those numbers are a good moment to transition into talking about our first speaker, Gary Ivory, who provides some of those kinds of services. He's going to talk a little bit about his vision for now that New York has finished raising the age, and many other states have also done so. His state of Texas is still considering it, but as that movement sort of, in some senses, comes to a conclusion, like what is next for juvenile justice in the coming years and decade, especially after a pandemic that has devastated low-income communities and a nationwide uprising over racial justice. So looking forward to hearing from Gary. Gary, if you're all set, we will pass it off to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And I want to begin just by a quote from James Baldwin. I always like to begin with quotes. And he says, "For these are all our children, we will either profit by or pay for whatever they become. And I use that term children loosely. But I am glad that you mentioned, Michael, in your overview, that a lot of neuroscience and cognitive psychologists say that, we know now that the brain doesn't stop developing 20 to your 24 or so, 24, 25. And so just thinking about that, and thinking about also that places such as where I am today in Dallas, Texas, that the few states that still don't, that still have 16 to 17-year-olds, where your age majority becomes 17 instead of 18. So there's still a lot of work to be done, but great progress in New York State. So I just want to talk about a few recommendations, suggestions, and what's next. We think from looking at the juvenile justice system, the progress is made, as well as things that can still yet be done. One is going upstream to address the needs of more complex needs, young people. And we think that going upstream, especially to address the needs of young people who are older, up to age 24, where there's a reason to believe that they can't be released because of safety concerns, either their safety or the community's safety. And we've found that and know that oftentimes the whole notion that community safety being an issue takes off the table of releasing certain people from jails or prisons. And so we think that there are alternatives, that there's a way to do the work to get people released that doesn't jeopardize public safety or doesn't jeopardize the safety of that individual. That having a continuum of robust, individualized, strength-based, family-focused, culturally and linguistically competent, and relationship-based support, regardless of who's providing that service or that support to young people, that those are very critical elements or ingredients in helping to ensure on an individualized basis, we're able to return people from jails or prison or divert them from them in the first place in a way that doesn't jeopardize public safety. And so those are some elements that we know have been proven to work. Secondly, investing in other approaches such as credible messengers, that both hire people from high-risk conditions and engage young people, again, up to age 24, 25, who have the most complex needs. And we know that works. We can do this without jeopardizing public safety. Third suggestion, recommendation that we have seen is developing release plans so that young people can return home sooner. Again, this notion that many years ago in Chicago that we had about 25 young people we helped to return home from a prison. Actually, at that time, it was literally a prison, that were kids who were dually involved. They were in the child welfare system, but they also were in the committed offenses that landed them in the adult system. And we were able to return well over 25 of those young people back home safely and at a cost savings to the state. So that can be done. And New York State, I think, has made progress, but I'm sure we can go upstream more to deal with those older young people, again, up to age 24. Another key strategy is assuring that workforce and economic opportunities, subsidizing employment, engaging young people in forms of work that pays them a livable wage. Those are very key strategies, and our current workforce system oftentimes doesn't allow for young people to work because of their history or other difficulties, and finding a way that we can address that. Next, is being able to develop a whole continuum of care in the community, from that's able to engage young people and to provide the support on a 24/7 basis that they need. So instead of saying that we're going to create these categorical services only for a certain set of young people, that developing a whole continuum that can engage young people regardless of their needs, whether they're psychiatric needs, workforce, et cetera. So those are some of the suggestions that I would make. I'd be happy to answer questions. I just want to end with another quote that I like to say a lot by Albert Einstein. He always says that imagination is more important than knowledge. And this is really, to me, imagination work and not just knowledge work.
Thank you, Gary. Okay, so we're gonna pass it along now to Adilene Sierra. Take it away. Oh, Gary, mute yourself, and Adilene, unmute. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Adilene. I'm a research assistant for Youth Justice Research Collaborative. Just going to talk to you guys real quick about the kind of research that we've done throughout the past 2 years. We work a lot with advocates, attorneys, policy experts, professors, and also directly impacted people. So we did core observations, extensive core observations for about a year following the implementation of Raise the Age. We've also analyzed the data through a thematic analysis, did a lot of quantitative work, and also worked with focus groups consisting of system impacted teens. And our goal is to just overall hopefully improve the policy and practice for teens that are directly impacted by the system. So some of the issues that we've seen in the courts and throughout the research is the cost to youth and family, as in how much time is lost to the system, years lost to detention, and how much time is actually taken off from families that have to be present in these courts and they don't actually get paid for the day to be there. Another issue, for example, would be like mental health and substance abuse, and as in the lack of adequate care to address these issues within these courts. And like the only thing that we see is that they further criminalize both instead of actually holistically addressing them. And just overall, like a complete disregard and disrespect for families overall within these courtrooms. So one of the things that the kids have mentioned during the focus groups are things like over-policing and over-programming. So they've mentioned the issues with over-programming, and they've mentioned that a lot of these programs aren't actually suitable to their needs. They're inconvenient to get to and from. So we all know how transit in New York is. It's not very reliable. It takes forever to get from point A to point B. And that's obviously very exhausting for a 15-year-old to have to do like several times a week. And it's just overall like an inconvenience rather than actually helpful. Going back to over-policing, like the sheer number of cops in the neighborhoods, the aggression and tone used by court officers in the courtrooms, and all these alternatives to detention, like programs, like solutions like long programming sentences and long probation sentences. Like I've seen oftentimes they get like 3 years to probation, which is just an excessive sentence. And they often get punished when they're not compliant with these sentences. And it's pretty ridiculous, I think, to expect 15-year-olds to be compliant, considering that teenagers are just going to be teenagers. They're going through a lot, they're developing, they're still going through puberty, just normal things that regular teenagers go through. So it's unfair and unrealistic to hold them to these kind of expectations. I wonder, are we holding kids from upper class homes to the same standards, to the same kind of scrutiny? That's not what I've seen. So these things are just like another form of like over policing outside of simply just detaining them. These having these kids go through 3 years of the probation is just another form of over policing, as much even if they're not being arrested or held in jails. So are these courts actually punishing them in the interest of public safety, as we're told they're doing, or are they punished because of systemic failures that within their environment that are simply beyond their control? Something that I've noticed is that these judges are mostly not from these neighborhoods and don't actually have an understanding of the kind of living conditions that these kids have to go through. There's like a complete disconnect between the judges and the court officers and the teens. There are two complete different realities. And there's just, how do you bridge that gap within a courtroom? To me, it seems impossible to do so. So I personally feel like, and the project also feels like, the youth should have a say on what goes on in their lives. they should be given some agency, because it seems like when they go through the system, this agency is completely provoked from them. They should have a voice in what comes next, what comes after this. And personally, a long-term vision would be ending detention for all youth and living in a world that doesn't involve policing, criminalizing, addressing these things in courtrooms, because in actuality, these courtrooms don't actually address their material needs at all. An immediate demand, I think, would be to just allocate these resources to these communities, to these neighborhoods, to these families. And that means investing in programs that actually interest them, investing in jobs for them, investing in summer programs, activities for them to do, actually maybe even handing out stimulus checks to kids, because adults don't even have these stimulus checks yet. So I think teens should be included in that. They're oftentimes, like children of color are oftentimes the supporting backbone financially for their families, and they have to keep doing so. Like generationally. So yeah, that's all I have. Thank you for having me again. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Adilene, very much. Okay, and now next, I'm just gonna pass it off to Julia Davis.
Great. It is hard to follow Gary and Addie, I gotta say, but there are some really powerful pieces that I wanna try and connect to. One, Gary asked us to bring imagination to this work, and Addie just gave us a vision of what a future could look like, a really big idea, an idea that can move us beyond detention, beyond courtrooms as the entryway to services and supports that young people might need. I think there is always urgency in this work. But as Michael said, we are really in a new moment right now. The death of George Floyd, the death of Breonna Taylor at the hands of police, young people in New York leading in the streets this summer, calling for racial justice, confronting the racism inside our policing and our youth justice system, creates really a new framework, a new urgency for us, a time for us to pick up this work again with a new focus. And I think, as recently as yesterday, we in New York saw that the death of Daniel Prude at the hands of police in Rochester did not result in an indictment of police. Just a few weeks ago, we saw a 9-year-old girl who was pepper sprayed and handcuffed and taken into police custody. So this moment right now, I think, helps us look at 4 things. One, the community reinvestment that Gary and Addie are asking us to focus on. What do we need to build in our communities to serve young people? It also forces us to confront this mental health intersection with youth justice that the events in Rochester, I think, really laid bare for us. It also, in the context of COVID, how do we move forward in New York with economic recovery and community resiliency? We need projects that really center young people in that recovery. And as Gary said, economic participation, employment, making sure our young people can be a part of that and that their contact with the criminal justice system doesn't derail those opportunities. These are the things we need to be thinking about in New York's youth justice. So let me back into some of those ideas. We are closing 4 youth prisons this year, hopefully. This is a proposal from the governor in the budget. This has enormous opportunity for reinvestment in our community. And we've done it before. New York has created reinvestment funds for community youth justice work with the closure of facilities. And right now we have an opportunity, I think, to go deeper. There are models from other parts of the country. In California, their youth justice reinvestment model requires that almost all the money go into community-based organizations to serve young people directly, not inside of government systems. And I think both Gary and Addie are really raising fundamental questions about where young people feel comfortable to be seen for who they are, to be given an opportunity to be self-determined and to get what they need. And a reinvestment strategy that centers community-based organizations is one piece of that. When we think about the mental health context here, I think New York is really blessed to have some very powerful, visionary new leaders and old leaders in our legislature who are advancing legislation right now that confront this intersection of mental health and children in crisis. A bill right now on the floor to end the use of pepper spray against children. We cannot use pepper spray in juvenile facilities anywhere in the state of New York, but where police are allowed to use it on children in our streets and in our communities. It makes no sense. So that piece of legislation is fundamental. It's small, but really critical to affirming our obligation to protect children and communities. We also see bills that are coming up like Daniel's Law that are about really requiring communities to develop standards and protocols and systems for decentering police. And as Addie said, really taking police out of the equation of community safety when it comes to mental health crisis, really being able to put in a mental health response. And we also see legislation that's advancing a task force to to focus on suicide risk for Black youth. We have to address the fundamental concerns and mental health vulnerabilities. Like Gary was saying, the very high needs young people that come in and go deep into the system. We need to really be thinking about how we better serve those young people in the community. When we think about community and economic health and well-being, the recovery from COVID is going to require all our teenagers and young adults to be part of that. So that's why we're moving forward with youthful offender legislation that's expanding laws that we have on the books right now that prevent young people that are going to the adult criminal court from having a criminal conviction that can derail jobs and academic opportunities and can make many young people deportable. So part of what Gary mentioned was emerging adulthood, trying to press these protections we associate with childhood up further and further. The bill that we're advancing is about making those protections go all the way to 25. And as we're thinking in this really broad way with a lot of imagination and creativity, we need to sort of redirect our system and take the youngest kids out altogether. The very youngest children under the age of 12, don't belong in the hands of police ever, whether it's a mental health crisis or whether it's another type of issue. What they need are resources and supports in the context of their family. They don't need the trauma of the police car being booked or being brought to court. And so the last bill that I think is sort of on our radar as we think about this continuum is about raising that lower age of juvenile delinquency to 12, another bill that has been successful in California and Massachusetts. So really trying to think about this whole continuum of youth justice in the community, the supports that are necessary outside of these court systems, and also this age range of really 7 to 25. All of these young people, who are they and what do they need? So Michael, thank you so much for the opportunity to start this conversation.
Okay, thank you all for the invigorating remarks. It's really interesting stuff. We are now gonna shift to kind of hopefully a free-spirited dialogue now with the whole group, so you can all unmute. I'm gonna ask a couple questions, starting off. This is one for the whole group. So, and we'll go maybe one by one we can answer. So state figures show, and this is kind of building on a theme a couple of you mentioned. So state figures show that 95% of New York City's 16 and 17-year-olds admitted to the highest security juvenile detention centers, and 84% across the rest of the state are Black or Latino. And I bring that up because this also came up in the Governor Andrew Cuomo's Raise the Age Task Force, which was a group of social service providers, law enforcement, and advocates who got together to review implementation of that law. And even though they called it overall a success, they strongly emphasized in the beginning of the report that the state still faces deep and persistent racial disparity in its juvenile justice system. So the system is shrinking dramatically before and after Raise the Age, but the disparities have not really changed at all. Raise the Age was not designed to address that, and it doesn't seem to have. So given that, I'm just wondering, in light of what happened this past year and the response to George Floyd, I mean, how do we address that issue in particular? And how do you kind of, how do you rank, I guess, or prioritize between shrinking the system, changing how it operates in terms of punitive versus rehabilitative? And can you do both at the same time? I don't know. I'm interested to hear what you all think on that.
Yes, I'll start here. The persistence of race as a problem in that as we reduce numbers, whether we're talking about secure detention or adult jails, that it seems like still the people that show up in the system are African American, Latino, they're brown and Black young people, and that's across the country. That's East, West, and the middle of the country as well. So just a couple of thoughts on that. One is a response in some places is to invest more into violence interruption, that before we can do any economic development things, do violence interruption, and then we'll get to doing economic development and other things. We don't have good data on that yet, but a lot of states and jurisdictions are moving toward that approach. I think we have to look seriously at policing, and I think a lot of this has to do with where police are policing. It's usually in low-income communities. It's usually in those communities are large degree African-American and people of color. And so I think that's just an issue about where police do their policing. That's an issue. Then the response, if they are arrested, what is our response going to be afterwards? We know the more contact people have with the juvenile system or the adult system, the more likely they are to penetrate further into that system. And so the system response has to be, let's have as less contact as possible with the system. And I think that will help. Then I think on the intervention side, in the community setting, are we doing the right interventions at the right time with the right approaches? And are we hiring people who live in those neighborhoods? We like to call them GED to PhD, the people that live in the neighborhood. So many approaches don't hire them. So we import people into neighborhoods, Black and brown neighborhoods, who may not be from that culture, may not understand the culture. Not they all should come from the culture. I'm just simply, I think we need to invest more in those type of approaches. There are a lot of those models. We're one, there are a lot of others that hire people from those same zip codes. And I think that will go a long way to addressing some of these inequities. So I think if we do those three strategies simultaneously, we might begin to see some reduction around the disproportionality, 99.5% being Black and brown.
I say yes to everything Gary just said. I think that's absolutely the way we need to go. I'd add one more thing, which is we need to decarcerate the young people that are there.
Yes.
So we need to be doing much more to bring kids home and to bring people that are in prison now that were prosecuted as children home. And if this brain science is just as applicable to people who are older now but committed crimes when they were younger, and they should have the benefit of those arguments and opportunities to come out of prison cells in the same ways that we're doing for young people today.
Before you jump in, Adilene, I just want to remind people, please keep the questions coming. I'm starting to see some stuff pop up, but feel free. We will get to them, I promise. We're just going to go through a couple initial questions from me, but we're happy to see a lot. So, okay, sorry, go ahead, Adilene.
Yeah, it's okay. I agree. It's exactly the points that Julia and Gary made. It's not that Black and brown people are doing more crimes. It's the fact that more police are in our neighborhoods, and that's really it. We don't see the same amount of cops posted in the Upper West Side. We see them in the South Bronx. We see them in Harlem, and there's a reason for that. So that's really the root of it.
And keeping on that theme a little bit, I thought maybe we could talk about COVID. I got a couple questions about that. I think first, big picture, I'm wondering if any of your reform goals, anyone in the group, have changed at all because of COVID. I mean, some of the ideas you've thrown out, a lot of them I think I've heard before and after that crisis, but is it just increased urgency, or is there any new ideas that have really come to the fore because of what that crisis has revealed about our society?
Well, I think for us is that two things. One is we have seen fewer young people in many cities across the country that we operate programs not be arrested as much just simply because they don't want to do any new admissions. And so, and that's a great thing. And we've also seen many, especially detention centers, secure detention centers, depopulate to return a lot of kids home. As a result, we haven't seen, in most of those jurisdictions, we haven't seen crime increase as a result of that, which tells us that, when you do decarcerate, it doesn't necessarily mean the young people are going to recidivate and the crime's going to get out of control. And so we have learned from that experience and tried to use this as a teaching moment to say, we can do this without, jeopardizing public safety. We don't have to operate with this fear of, public, crime being out of control as a result of these measures. So that's kind of how we're using this pandemic moment to try to address some of these inequities, kind of getting us to accelerate it, not, go backwards to what we were previously doing.
And anything to add, Julia or Adilene?
No, I think we learned some lessons with COVID about, like Gary is saying, being able to keep a lot of kids out of detention. And the state and the city and communities across New York worked really hard to get kids home because of the risks faced in these facilities. And I think it challenges us to say, why isn't that, the everyday life of our system? Why doesn't it look that much smaller? And why aren't we approaching it with the same type of flexibility and thinking about young people?
Yeah, I think it's only, sorry, we keep doing that. I think it's, like Julia said, it's, we've kept these kids out of detention because of COVID, but it shouldn't have to take COVID, another pandemic, for us to do so. We shouldn't be regressing back to the old ways where we have like a couple hundred locked up for no reason. Yeah, I think it just calls for the urgency of it, really.
And I wonder, all three of you, I'd love to hear, what has the COVID response looked like? Gary, I'd love to know nationally, like how your programs had to change and what they observed, how they observed systems reacting, and what were the biggest challenges. We've talked about, all of us have talked about this every day for months now, but I'm wondering if there's anything new you can think of that that surprised you in particular that you could share.
Yes.
And Julia, in New York, I'd be happy to hear, and Adilene also for New York, in particular the South Bronx, maybe, like what does it look like? What does it look like now, rather, as we approach maybe the light at the end of the tunnel with vaccines? I think we just got an appointment here in this household, which I'm really excited about, but most people are not having that experience yet. So we still have a ways to go, but maybe the end is in sight. What does it look like from your purchase?
So from where I sit, youth advocate programs, we, when COVID hit last early March of last year, we had to change our youth and family engagement strategy, because our strategy was hire people from the neighborhood, GED to PhD, do this individualized assessment and connect them with this paid advocate, a paid mentor. And so what this did, COVID did, we were doing about 10 to 15 hours a week supporting young people. What that did was shift us to more teleservices, virtual services, which was really challenging, but we quickly adapted within 30 days and shifted to doing more virtual support for young people and gave them the technology so that we could talk to them, virtually, which was great. The broader system response we saw is that a lot of detention centers kids weren't being detained. We saw a lot of good responses. And so we think some of those responses were good, but the biggest one for us was just shifting to a virtual environment instead of being face-to-face, because everything we do is face-to-face. You even have to change how we transport young people, because we do a lot of, transporting, picking kids up and doing a lot of activities with them and their family members. And all of that we had to cease and desist. So that was a challenge, but it's one we're quickly adapted to.
I think just inaccessibility to a lot of things, like South Bronx care, to testing, to maybe even like vaccinating, internet access, just like simple things. Yes.
You know, the project, the Youth Justice Research Collaborative that Addie works on and that I work on, you know, we surveyed defenders in New York City and service providers in New York City to find out how COVID was impacting the youth justice system. And it is, the findings reveal that young people are more vulnerable than ever before. There's food insecurity. There are huge problems with young people having access to technology, to participate in school or to attend remote court appearances that are not in person. There are enormous struggles even with telehealth and remote connecting with young people, not being able to physically be together. And young people facing homelessness or instability at home because of sort of the secondary effects of COVID in the community, the economic disruption and vulnerability. So it's a difficult time for young people who are in the youth justice system and who are living in COVID, in terms of being able to connect and get what they need from people who are in the community in person. And the same in the buildings. They've worked hard to push in remote programming and supports, but it's not the same for those who are detained or in placement. It's not the same with seeing people in person every day who can meet their needs and participate in school and other types of things. So we're operating at a real deficit because of COVID, and we need to be really thinking about the needs of these young people as we come out of COVID and how they're going to be different and probably deeper than young people who've been involved in youth justice in the past.
I'm curious, Adilene, did you do the Court Watch project for the collaborative, or were you doing I'm wondering if you were one of those people who sat in court or if you were working on other projects.
Yeah, I did a whole year of extensive court watching for the project.
Great. Well, I wrote about that report you guys put out, I think it was a few months ago, and you had some really powerful observations about how the courtrooms you observed in routine practices and protocols continued to feel like a dehumanizing and criminalizing environment for young people. I'm wondering, could you talk a little bit about what that looked like, what you observed, maybe a little more specifically, and how you saw that play out? And I'm also wondering if your team, have you been able to observe virtual court at all? We just reported today some defenders kind of like some aspects of the remote access and the easier access virtually, but you don't have to show up. There's also tons of challenges that come with that, but there might be some mixed benefits actually to operating virtually and for some routine hearings. So I'm just curious, talk a little bit about what you saw before the pandemic and any efforts you guys have taken since the pandemic set in to continue observing the courts.
Well, court watching was only meant to be for a year, and thankfully, conveniently, it was right before COVID hit. So that's when we ended our court observations. So we haven't had to deal with any of the virtual ones, but I agree, there are a lot of pros to it. There are also a lot of cons to it. Like I was talking earlier, a lot of like internet inaccessibility to a lot of poor kids that just don't have access to it. But to your first question, some of the things that I saw in the courtroom are a lot of these court officers are just really aggressive in their tone, their body language. Like it seems to me like they are set there to like kind of intimidate the families and the kids. It's just a very hostile environment. I remember seeing a case once where a mom was crying as her child was like handcuffed and he was being sentenced to something. And he kept trying to like look back at them, and she was just a bit hysterical. And one of the court officers came up to her and kind of like just told her to shut up, to like be quiet, and like threatened to like kick her out, and like kind of made a whole scene about it. And it's just like a disregard for the time that they're going through, that family was going through. Obviously, it's a lot to take in, and I feel like it seems like a lot of these court officers just don't take that into consideration. It seems more of like a power trip day for them, like that's what they're in for, and it's not really it's just not a cute setting, to be honest.
Okay, so another kind of a hot button question, but shootings across much of the country have increased in the past year. Many other categories of crime are down, but I'm wondering, what, if any, challenges to the vision you all have presented today does that present? And keeping in mind, I've spoken to criminologists who think the economic and demographic data suggests this isn't a permanent, durable increase that's going to reach the historic highs of the 80s and 90s. So I'm just curious, though, how do you factor that into your planning around reform and the services you provide?
Well, I can speak to it from a service delivery standpoint. We factored that in. In fact, we do some models like in Baltimore, DC, that a cure violence model. In Safe Streets, Incredible Messenger, I won't get into all the nuances of them. But the bottom line is that we are trying to arrest gun and interpersonal violence. But first of all, gun violence, reducing that with high-risk individuals. And then trying to do whatever wraparound support they need so that guns don't become the issue. So I'm seeing a lot of that happening across the country, where there's a lot of focus on reducing gun violence, very intentionally. And so I see that as a good response, because to me, you have to deal with the gun violence before, or the violence, interpersonal violence, before you can get to some of the other issues. And it's a driving factor, which gets a lot of these people that are elected, whether it's a prosecutor, whomever, that has this punitive response. So we think there are some alternative responses that doesn't rely upon police response, which is what we try to do to engage people in the streets where they live and reduce those gang violence, those kind of things, so that it doesn't result in gun violence.
I think, from the policy perspective, the policy advocates perspective, we need to be focusing on the enormous economic stress that's happening in communities and the amount of death and illness that's happening because of COVID. And we really can't look at this as a moment to step away from reforms. It's really critical that we stay on this path. The Center for Court Innovation did some really powerful work on young people and guns, why young people carry guns, why it's deeply related to senses of vulnerability and community safety, that we need to confront through much deeper work in reinvestment and economic support and community resilience. So, it's the type of conversation that I think we're increasingly going to have. I'm really glad you raised it. But I think we can't let it get in the way of continuing to do this work.
Yeah, I think we need to look at why these things are even happening. And it's not because people are just suddenly trigger happy. There are reasons for this. And it's most likely like economic reasons. Like I mentioned earlier, we still don't have any kind of stimulus checks. We should be having them monthly. And all this instability, housing, food, financial instability, it all creates, these are all reasons why people would do something like that. And I think that's what we should be looking at and how to address that instead of like further criminalizing it, which doesn't really solve the root of the issue.
Thank you. So we're gonna go to audience questions now. We've got a lot of interesting thoughts here. So this is what I'm gonna start with Melissa Sickmund, who also, if you're out there, please keep the questions coming. We'll try to get to as many as we can. We've still got about some time to get through these. So this is a kind of a technical question, but does New York have data to assess whether youth of color have equitable access to interventions that are most effective? And more generally, whether or not there is that data, do you all have a sense of whether there is equitable access or not?
I have never seen data like that, so I don't know it. But I think everything we hear from, we've just been doing focus groups with young people here in New York City. We've been talking with young people all across the state about youth justice, and a lot of them feel like these services don't match who they are and what they need, and they're not there to support their growth and development on the trajectory that they want to pursue. So, at least from the stories of young people that we have as inputs, I think there's a disconnect in a lot of places between what's out there and what young people want and need.
Any other thoughts, Gary or Adilene?
No, we don't have the data on that. I will say that so often the services and supports young people receive is determined by the system offerings and what they fund and things like that. So that is a big driver of that. But that's why I mentioned in my presentation about a more individualized approach, that it should be driven by the needs of and circumstances that that particular young person and their community and their family. And you should develop a plan around that. That creates a plan of action instead of creating only saying we're going to do therapy and a few set of other things for a young person. We call that categorical. And when it's categorical, it restricts the voice and choice of the person who is the recipient of the services. The person who's the recipient should be able to say, this is what I need. I need transportation. I need assistance with college. I need a part-time job. I need mental health supports. I need this. And that's the approach. And if you're doing that, it's more tailored to their unique needs and circumstances.
Okay. We have another question from, I might know the answer to this one, but it's, does the Juvenile Justice Act in New York have separate sections for children in need of care and protection and children in conflict with the law? So I think more generally, and Julia, maybe you have a sense of this, does the child welfare part of the New York State Family Court Act, how does that interact with the juvenile justice rules in state law? And how, I mean, I know we have one family court in New York that hears both cases. I think it's usually different judges that hear that, but they have similar training. So, but maybe Julia, you could speak a little bit more to how those systems interact, foster care and, or just child welfare generally, even if a kid's not in foster care yet, but how does that interact with juvenile justice here? And Gary, maybe you can speak about other states if you're familiar.
Yes, okay.
Yeah, in New York, we have juvenile delinquency, which is when a child is being basically prosecuted for a crime in family court. We have the child welfare system, which is about child protection, and that's a separate sort of part of the system, both in terms of the legal process and also the types of some of the types of the care and institutions that young people go to. And then sort of in the middle, we have something called PINS, which is persons in need of supervision, which is, straddling this line between, things that are not illegal, but things that we're trying to control kids for. So we have sort of three different pathways into a court system for children. And often in many jurisdictions, the local entity, the local county people that are working with those kids are sort of the same across all those three categories. And the goal in all of these settings is really guided by sort of what's in the best interest of the child and how the child, what needs do the child have that aren't being met. That doesn't make them any less punitive. Child welfare cases can result in a parent ending up on a state register that can prevent them from getting employment. The delinquency system has all of the perils and problems that, that Addie has talked about in terms of the experiences of children going to court and court officers and the experiences of their families, detention, placement, institutionalization. So yes, the answer is we do have different ways of thinking about children and their behaviors and different doorways through the courthouse. But they're all highly flawed.
Yes, I agree with Julia's comments about that. First, those three pathways in New York State, we're in 15 counties and we deal with all three of those particular pathways. And but in different states, of course, it varies. So I won't get into that. Just suffice it to say that one of the things we this applies to both child welfare and juvenile justice. I've had conversations with several judges in different states, and they often, and we have judges on our board, so I'm always interfacing with judges. And judges oftentimes say, I've heard this many years, that the notion of who can adequately supervise and support a young person is a big driving factor as to how or why they release some young people and whether they don't release others. It's different in a child welfare setting because you're talking about child maltreatment, abuse, neglect, those kind of issues. Whereas in juvenile justice, you're very interested in the young person's safety, the community's safety, and whatever the offense was and how you respond to that offense. But regardless, this whole notion of supervision and who can provide that supervision and who can't, that drives a lot of out-of-home removals And we know when there's out of home removal, you go down that slippery slope of whether it's to a residential treatment facility or to a secure care facility, it all leads to more contact with the juvenile and adult system. And that is a huge challenge that we've experienced over the years. And it leads to a lot of disproportionality.
I will just add, as an outlet that's kind of uniquely focused on both of those systems, we are always looking for stories that look that sort of explore the intersection of those two systems. So anyone out there, please bring us those stories, because we do want to try to tell them. And Adilene, anything to add on that?
No, I think Julia and Gary said it better than I could have, and I agree with them.
Great, thanks. Another question from Marilyn. This is something I haven't actually really heard too much about, but we, other reporters who I work with have heard about it from judges. What are your thoughts on the role that fetal alcohol syndrome and the requisite brain damage that might come with that? What role might that be playing in juvenile justice system exposure, if any? I think I asked that right, but.
Yeah, I can't exactly speak to that. I just don't have the data, to support that. It's not something we assess for, anything like that. So. I can say, though, that the role of substance use is a big driver in child welfare removals, and also it's a big driver in what we see in how and whether kids become so-called delinquent or not, because they're sometimes responding to the needs of who their caregivers are, whether parent, whomever. And substance use is a huge issue. That is a huge issue, but particularly around fetal alcohol syndrome is not one we're familiar with. One of the things we've done is try to get as many people who are in recovery, and they've been at least 2 years out of recovery, and hire them as recovery advocates, recovery mentors, peer support specialists, so that they can help to support other people around their recovery issues. I know fetal alcohol syndrome doesn't necessarily mean somebody is actively abusing alcohol at that time, but that is a response to it.
I'll say to the questioner, we'll look into it. We'll check that out. It's not something I'd heard about too much. So another question about, well, I guess, sort of a point, but also a question. Adilene, I'm interested to hear your thoughts about accessibility in the courts. We continually hear about the importance of reform, but in essence, won't these systems and the impact of youth detention intrinsically always be ableist? Any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think prisons and courtrooms are by definition ableist. Like there's nothing like humanizing about them in general. So I think they would be ableist. And in terms of accessibility, I don't think there is much, but I do know that there is an inaccessibility for like languages, like people understanding what's really going on. And even though there are interpretatives to help you understand like word for word what's happening, there's no one really there to like sit down and explain to you, like as a parent, if you don't speak the language, to sit down and explain to you like what is actually going on with the case.
Thank you. So we're actually, it looks like we're just about out of time. So last question, we'll do a quick round the room. What are you most optimistic about in the area of juvenile justice for 2021? And if any of you have thoughts in particular on a new administration, a new Congress, and what they might do, happy to hear that as well, but feel free to take it wherever you want.
I'm very optimistic about two things. One is just more of a focus around gun violence reduction as a response to racial injustice. I've seen a lot of cities, jurisdictions are investing around credible messenger, cure violence, other type models that are similar to what we're doing nationally. So I'm very hopeful about that. Very hopeful that we're going to, some jurisdictions are going upstream. States are saying that they want to deal with a higher risk young people, and they want to deal with older youth in the juvenile justice system as well, the 24 to 25-year-olds. So those are promising and hopeful. They're aspirational, but I think we have to be aspirational as we do the work.
So with the project and during the focus groups, we've been talking about doing things with the young people and doing more artistic things. So I think that's something to look forward to, something cool that would happen this year and something that we hope to establish soon.
And I want to build on Gary and Addie. I'm here to follow young people in this work. That's what I'm excited about. I'm excited about what young people are telling us they need and about their leadership in this moment that we have been living in over the last year. And I think we need to work harder to create spaces so that that leadership can grow and we can follow and support them. So that's what I'm excited about for 2021.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much to everybody who attended. Thank you to everyone who chipped in questions. Thank you to our panelists above all. And also thank you to my colleagues, John Kelly and Christine Onjoko and Talia Henderson, who helped organize this. Please check out imprintnews.org. We explore all of these issues every day, every week, exhaustively. We've also covered a lot of the issues that came up today. So you can find all that work there or reach out to us to talk about it further. You can find my email on all of my stories and anything else any of my colleagues write. The emails are always at the bottom of the page, and find us on social media. And anyway, you know all that. So thank you again, everybody, for coming here. And hopefully this is the first of many future similar conversations about what's happening with juvenile justice in New York and beyond. Okay, thank you. Have a good afternoon, everyone.